Okay, hi everybody. My name is Tony Lyon. I'm currently a production engineering manager for Facebook in New York. Until Thursday, I was a Facebook manager for production engineering in Seattle. You may know me from a previous role as SRE manager at Google, or Corp Eng manager at Google, or various and sundry other. I've been a technical manager for about 20 years, so caveat emptor, some of the biases that I'm going to have in the presentation are coming from a managerial point of view. A lot of the things should still apply in terms of working with teams. I would also say I am not specifically trying to address individual telecommuters. When I say distributed locations, I'm not really talking about telecommuters, although some of the content will apply. Likewise, I'm not really talking necessarily about follow-the-sun models across different locations, but again, a lot of the same how you build team culture, that kind of stuff should still apply. So why me? I have been a teleworker. I have also managed teams across multiple locations in EMEA for Google. I also manage teams across North and South America while at Google. I've been in a distributed location for both Amazon, Google, and Facebook now. And so I have a lot of experience. I want to share my opinions and my ideas with you. There's a lot of you that probably have as much experience managing across these locations as I do. Hopefully I'm reinforcing what you're doing right. At the same time, hopefully I can offer a few ideas that you may want to take home with you. So that's why me. So my first distributed team that I had to work with was at Boeing. It was on the 787 program. Some of you may have seen this diagram floating around the net recently. Boeing decided that they wanted to distribute the engineering for 787 across a multitude of engineering partners, across EMEA, across the Pacific. And like part of my team was responsible for ingesting and redistributing the engineering diagrams and making sure that all the teams were caught up all the time on what was going on with the design of the aircraft. The wins, the good news from that project was one of the things that Boeing did was they gained access to expertise, engineering expertise they didn't have. Ceramics and carbon fiber manufacturing was much more advanced in Japan at the time. They started working on this. They gained access to those engineers in Japan by partnering with those companies. We also fleshed out some of the logistics of how you do this, how you distribute that engineering data and pull it back in a way that now Boeing can go forward with manufacturing and designing aircraft like this on into the future. The bad news is we missed on some stuff, mostly around the human side. A particular example that I remember was we had a project manager that scheduled a stand-up meeting with Alenia in Italy at 9:30 p.m. on Friday morning Pacific time. That's 6:30 p.m. in Italy. The first couple of meetings, they were very dutiful and attended, very, very well represented. And the third or fourth, they started to dial it in literally from the bar. We learned our lesson. That was a very subtle way. They never complained. They never said anything bad, but you could hear the clinking of dishware in the back. And, you know, we learned. We learned. So I decided to break this talk into three main areas, focusing on communications, things you want to think about when you're communicating across distributed sites and take into account. Inclusion, how you kind of form and build a distributed team or one team out of distributed sites. And then how you adapt, because inevitably things will go wrong. So let's talk about communications. The first thing I want to talk about is goals and expectations. It's really, really important that you communicate goals very clearly, but it's probably a good idea to mimic the three-way handshake here. Some cultures have, they don't like to indicate that they didn't hear or didn't understand communication. It's really important that you maybe get them to repeat that back so you know for sure the information was delivered. It's also a good idea to share the ownership of setting those goals. Give your distributed locations agency in defining goals. Give them agency in like setting expectations. That's, again, really important for building an inclusive team. And look for shifts in gravity. There are moments when teams reach a certain inflection point that they're large enough to maybe go from a small discrete component in a project to a complete end-to-end project. Look for those moments when you can assign ownership and responsibility for the goal setting to that team at that point. We want to talk about formal versus spontaneous communication. Formal communications, what I'm thinking of here is regular team updates, regular team posts, maybe regular communications in your team meetings. Again, it's a good idea to share the ownership for that communication. It lets all of the distributed sites you may be working with in a team see each other as part of the project. They're communicating in across each other. Also, figure out your cadence, work with the team on that, take their feedback. on what makes the most sense for your team for the formal cycle. Spontaneous is one of a couple of things that is super, super critical for basically emulating physical presence. It's something that we do all the time. We walk into the office, we walk into the shop, we have a few quick words with folks. That kind of communication goes a long way for building trust, for building empathy, and for building relationships across the teams. So you need to kind of work at making space for that across distance. One way you can do that is in Messenger, in IRC, in Slack, in Hangouts. You can also consider VC. If you have the ability to do video conferencing, I've seen teams very effectively do things like keep an open video conference channel with their different locations. That way, if somebody has a question, they unmute the mic, they reach in and they talk, and the talk goes back and forth. Not all teams do this. Again, you're going to have to adapt to what works best for your team. But if you can do it, it's one of those things where the actual physical appearance, we communicate in a lot of silent, subtle ways when we're talking face-to-face. It's really important, and it just helps build those relationships. Coaching. Most of us don't come out of the box as great communicators. So you're going to have to spend some time and invest some time helping people to become good communicators and to think about communication. You're going to need to help them identify opportunities to communicate. You're going to need to help them with crafting good communications. And you're going to need to recognize them when they do communicate well so that it's clear that that's a good, positive behavior. You want to reward that good behavior. Personal and casual. This is another thing that is really critical for, again, kind of imitating presence. You want to make time for what people call small talk. And it's sometimes used as a derogatory term. This is really important. If you have one-on-ones with your manager, or if you're a manager, one-on-ones with your people, save a little bit of time, either at the front or the end of your meeting, to just talk about random stuff. It's not wasted time. Talk about your sports ball, or talk about whatever you think or that person wants to talk about. But again, that kind of personal and casual communication is really critical, not just for building a relationship, but for establishing trust, and you will begin to build empathy for them, and they will begin to build empathy with you. And for myself, I kind of follow a guideline to try and over-communicate. If I feel like I'm over-communicating, I probably am doing just about right. You'll get clear feedback from your teams if you actually are over-communicating. Don't worry. People will let you know if it's too much. But in general, it helps keep you from forgetting to communicate. Like, just think about communicating all the time, every opportunity. Okay, so let's talk about inclusion. Somebody asked me before the talk last week, like, well, how do you do this? And I said, well, it's really important to have empathy. You get, yeah, but how do you do that? So let's first talk about cultures. There are so many layers of lenses of culture that we all carry on with us. I mean, if you've ever had a class on inherent bias, you're probably familiar with some of this. But basically, we all carry company culture, team culture, city culture, family culture, not to mention national and ethnic culture with us everywhere we go. Just recognize that that's there, that you're going to be navigating through your lenses and the person that you're communicating with. It's going to take some work. Just recognize that those things are there. Over time, you'll figure it out. You'll understand. You'll develop empathy. But just recognize that you're going to have to invest a little bit more effort in navigating those communications. Time zones. How many of you actually work with a team closely that is not proximal to where you sit? So pretty much most of the room, if not all the room. Time zones. We do it so well, right? Yeah. I deliberately chose this picture because it's probably the most confusing time zone. It's on the international dateline that I could find. It's a work in progress, but you have to keep thinking about it, always be thinking about it. And if you can find ways, there are probably lots of different strategies that people have developed or that you can develop to help remember, help keep that in mind, world clocks, so that you develop empathy. Really important. We never get this quite right, so it'll always be a thing you need to be thinking about. Good meeting hygiene, as important as that is regularly in a regular work situation, it's super important over distance. And by here, I'm thinking some teams, for example, have decided that they want to make meetings about decisions. They don't want meetings to be about the discussion. Discussion can happen in email, or discussion can happen over chat. But the idea is, so you go into that meeting, the purpose is to make a decision. That works for some teams, that may work for you. It's a thing to think about. Keep your meetings as short as they possibly can be. Make sure that meetings are communicated well in advance. You may want to make sure that you have an agenda. If you don't have an agenda, you may prefer to cancel the meeting. If you cancel the meeting, make sure that you do it in advance. If you're working across time zones, people may have modified their personal schedules to make sure that they can attend that meeting. It'll be a little bit ornery if you cancel it without any notice. They're like, yeah. Ownership of meetings, again, is another thing. You can make the responsibility for creating and driving agendas the part of a team in a different location. You can make the ownership of scheduling the meeting and whatnot. Recurring meetings, again, time zones are a big factor here. You should try to never schedule recurring meetings outside of working hours for your locations. That's not always possible. I've seen some teams effectively alternate so that the pain is shared relatively equally. If you have time zones on either side of you, this becomes even more problematic. One of you is going to have to cover both of those. So one of you will feel double the pain. If it helps if that's the headquarters location, because it's clear that you're making the investment to make that work. Build good team traits. One of the things that a lot of teams that do this successfully, they tend to be a little bit more open, more transparent. They share things a little bit more widely. They're more sociable, or they develop sociability. They also, yeah, I would say sociable, and then they also tend to be a little bit more on organizational. They focus a little bit more time on being a little more prepared. They have to prepare things ahead of time because you're, again, dealing with distance. Watch your language, and by this I don't mean sailor talk. I mean, basically the reason why this talk is called Don't Call Me Remote is there was a kind of long-running debate when I was at Google in Seattle about being called remote, and the feeling that was derogatory, that was somehow hierarchical or derogatory, and there was a lot of objection to using that term. And I think we eventually landed on the term distributed at that point. That was when I started to try and remember to always call remote offices distributed offices, so that the sense is that it's less about the gravity of the center. At this point, Google had probably more people working outside of Mountain View than in Mountain View. There was an inflection point that we had reached. So it was a relatively straightforward conversation. But remember that. These little centric things are going to creep into speech, and again, this is not aimed at headquarters. This doesn't matter. This is as true as if you're sitting in a distributed location than if you're sitting in the main office. Watch out for these little centrisms that will creep in. Assume good intent. If you've done some of the things or most of the things that I've been talking about, then assume good intent when someone schedules a meeting at the wrong time. They probably tried to schedule at the right time in either the time criticality of the content of that meeting, or they couldn't get a spot on your schedule, or their schedule was messed up, whatever. Just assume that they did try. They made the effort to make it work, and they couldn't, so now they had to schedule a meeting outside of your time zone. Gather your tribe. This can be hard if you're a very large global organization. There may be opportunities for you to gather more regionally rather than all in one place. But gather your people together as much as you possibly can. A little investment and people spending time directly with each other, it pays off in so many ways. You get such a higher bandwidth collaboration, communication with the team all being together in one place. They very quickly build relationships. They very quickly build empathies. And then experience the other. If you can, go and work from that remote location, work from that distributed location as much as you can. Try and keep your regular schedule. You'd be surprised how quickly you adapt or you develop empathy for that location if you're trying to keep a Pacific time schedule in London. So let's talk quickly about adaptation. Being responsive to change is the most critical thing. Murphy lives. If it can go wrong, it probably will. That's okay. Roll with it. It's going to be fine. My personal rule is semper gumby, always flexible. Always be willing to adapt. I mean, this is something we do as SREs and production engineers anyway. We tend to have to constantly adapt to changing conditions and situations. So this is something should be a core competency for us. But just remember to be flexible. Don't let it shake you when the meeting goes sideways or someone has what seems like a culturally inappropriate communication. Be flexible. Local leadership. This is a thing that's super important. People feel much more strongly about their opportunities for career development, for career growth. They feel strongly about having an advocate for their location. Having a local leader on the ground, there's a point at which that becomes absolutely critical. Personally, the lesson learned for us was in Seattle. We probably should have been a little bit more aggressive in the production engineering teams there. We built very quickly with a lot of management straddling Menlo Park and Seattle. We probably should have had more local managers. We have clear feedback that people feel better about their career development, career growth if they've got a local manager. So be thinking about that from day one. Local opportunities and collaboration. And here I'm kind of thinking about, you may find that in a distributed location, two engineering teams that don't normally have any relationship to each other suddenly have the opportunity to combine their efforts on something. They may be working on roughly parallel tracks and be able to completely combine. They may have complementary projects that can come together to create an even larger project. This has happened in Seattle a couple of times where teams that in Menlo Park are not close to each other at all and don't really necessarily communicate, but because they're in the smaller location in Seattle and they actually sit next to each other, all of a sudden they find, hey, we should totally work on this together. And a couple of big projects have come out of that. So be looking for those opportunities. This is hard. This is hard. It takes effort. It takes commitment. You need to have commitment from all levels of management to make this work. You have to have commitment that it's going to take money. Travel budgets are going to be bigger if you're across distributed locations. That has to be okay. You have to be willing to spend the money to send people to those offices or have those people from those offices come to your office. That has to work. That's an absolutely critical thing because I've seen it where people don't do that. They go in with what they think is a limited budget, and it generally fails miserably. So just a real quick summarization. Goals, make sure you set your expectations and goals clearly. Think about sharing the setting of those goals and expectations with sites that are not your own. Think about your formal communications, making sure that the cadence and everything works for your team. Make space and time for spontaneous communications, using video conferencing or chats. Make time for personal and casual communications. That's, again, really important for humans. Coach your folks on communication. Coach people on how to do better at communicating, and then just sort of tend towards over-communication. Inclusion and empathy are absolutely critical for success. You have to find ways to build this. You've got these cultural lenses that you need to navigate. That's going to take some effort. That's going to take some time. You need to think about time zones. All of us want you to think about time zones. Meeting hygiene is super important, perhaps even more critical when you're working across distributed locations. Watch your language. Make sure you watch for centrisms that creep in that may be much more biased towards, like, say, one location over another. And assume good intent. People generally want to do the right thing. If they don't, then just assume that there was a mistake or that they didn't understand. Adaptation and flexibility. The first victim of battle is the plan, right? So don't be brittle. Don't go in with a set plan that you know is going to work in X number of weeks or X number of months. Be prepared for things to go a little bit weird. Plans are fragile. This takes effort. This takes money. Think about developing local leadership in your distributed locations and look for opportunities to take advantage of the engineering expertise or engineering collaborations you could have in those locations. And that's all I had prepared. So please, any questions? I'll do my best.
Yeah, you talked about this not being specific to kind of follow the sun teams, but I was curious if you had kind of some advice for building that kind of inclusion and empathy and stuff for follow the sun teams.
Yeah, in some ways I feel like this is a subset. Like, all of these things are just as critical because you need that team to be a team. But at the same time, for me, the weak spots when we've seen, that I've experienced at least trying to develop those kind of models is the handoff. Yeah. I mean, if you've done the work here, like you've built one team, you've got people feeling empathetic towards each other, you've got reasonably good communications, then you tend to avoid the us versus them problems that can crop up, except around the handoff. That's a pain point, and like figuring out how to communicate that effectively and make sure that the team that's receiving has empathy and like assumes good intent of the team that's handing off. Because a lot of times what happens is a problem will transition and they'll be like, oh, those bastards, why did they do that to us? So like, again, that seems to be that's where I would put most of my effort, is around those moments of that key moments of handoff, because it's a pressure point and it's a hard thing. So I don't have any clear like easy win there, but it's something, that's the thing I would pay the most attention to.
Do you recommend, because we're having a fight basically with my own team on the handoff, is doing kind of an IM based one better than forcing people to kind of do like a voice or video chat, and they'd rather not do video chat because obviously you have to be in a room or tied down or something to do that.
Some teams do, some teams don't. So you have to adapt. Again, it's like one of the things. Do what works for your team, and do what your team wants. It generally is the right thing to do. And it'll, like I say, it won't work sometimes. And adapt, iterate.
Good afternoon. Great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
A question. If you're working for a company that's had technology startup type origins, the distributed working environment is fairly welcomed or embraced. It's just a matter of implementing it the right way. What recommendation would you give to people working for corporations that are fundamentally and culturally a corporation that have dependencies on technology? So culturally they aren't as embracing of some cultural attributes, who has to make a case to centralized corporate headquarters or a HR body to allow a distributed type of employee environment if it's not the regular, if it's not the norm.
Yeah, and those are honestly some of the areas where we have less control over things. Like some of those core central services like human resources or facilities, or some of those core things are the places where we have, as engineers, maybe less influence. We can't build their teams for them. So we have to help them be aware, have a good relationship with, build and have a good relationship with people in HR facilities. That's something I've spent a lot of time developing, so that generally what I find is the local HR, if you have them, then they tend to be very sympathetic because they, like you, are in a distributed location. You can build an alliance with them around how can we make sure that our office moves forward in the right way and has the right presence and has the right priority for things. If you don't have an HRBP on site, then I would say build a relationship with your central people so that you can, as soon as possible, get them to put an HRBP on site, because like a local manager, having a human resources person that people can talk to for the universe of things that they want to talk to an HR person about is there. It's going to be important for them to feel like they have support from HR, just like from a manager. So I think I may have wandered off your question a bit, but does that help?
No, that's great. Appreciate it. Thank you.
You bet.
So I'm working out of the main office, but my boss is distributed. How do I balance keeping him involved while also working with the people who are right next to me? What are some advice for maintaining that open communication and facilitating his communication with the dev teams that I'm working next to, while also not being patronizing about it?
So in other words, you want to give him some feedback and some guidance on how he might be more successful in the managerial relationship.
I feel like we're having a fairly frequent, three-pronged communication where he'll say stuff to people and then they'll come talk to me about it, and then I'll relay back information back to him. And how do I get out of that cycle?
Well, I don't know if I can answer all of that in one fell swoop, but I would say a couple things occurred to me when you were asking your question. One is it might be very successful to get him to commit to writing and posting notes, or for you to commit to writing and posting notes when you have communications that you want the other to be aware of, but not necessarily participating directly in the conversation. So if you're publishing those things, there's always a place to go and read the notes, but you don't have to necessarily constantly invite them to meetings or have a third wheel or whatever. It doesn't feel awkward. So that's one way you could think about making sure that that's happening. How to build, it sounds like there's a little bit of how to build that trust. I do the right thing, land the right things, and then I think giving feedback too. I mean, it can be a bit of a crucial conversation, but I think as a manager, I appreciate when people tell me, hey, you know what, I've got this. You don't have to be so worried about it. Don't trust me that I will land this. You don't need to be involved all the time. I mean, I appreciate that feedback as a manager. So at some point, you may want to just have that direct communication and give him that feedback.
All right, cool.
You bet. Oh, that's it. I'm sorry.
No, it's all right.
No, I'm going to be standing right outside. So if you want to follow up, I'll be happy to answer any questions I can.
That works.
How's that?
It works.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.